Houston sports world lost a darn good broadcaster and a fine gentleman this past weekend. John O'Reilly passed away at age 72, and if you've been in Houston for a while, you heard John up and down the dial. I grew up listening to him on 740 KTRH and calling Oilers games. He also spent time at KSEV and KPRC, and joining me is John's longtime partner at KTRH and on Oilers games with Bum Phillips. Great to have Tom Franklin back with us. And Tom, I wish it was for better circumstances. What kind of a guy was John? What was it like working with him?
Robert, he was the absolute best, and thanks for the invitation to talk about him. John was initially my savior in my early days at KTRH. I got there in 1981, and when I was there, Jim Nance was still doing radio, and Jim Nance was doing sports in the morning drive news program on KTRH at that time, and he was also just starting his TV career and working weekends at Channel 11. And in the fall of '82, Jim got a job offer from KSL in Salt Lake City to start his TV career full time, and he went there. And so I got plugged into the morning drive news sports anchor position at that time, and my body clock by nature is a nighttime clock, and so me and mornings were having a hard time getting along, and they hired John early in 1983 to become the morning sports anchor, and I was forever thankful for that because it could get me back on my usual rotation. But I got to sit with this guy for the first week he was there to show him how we did things at KTRH, and back in those days we had typewriters and teletype machines. There were no computers to do all this stuff, and cart machines and all that sort of nonsense, and just walk him through the paces. But I got to see just what a talented professional he was. He was one of the greatest writers I've ever been around. His scripts were impeccable, and always said the right thing at the right time and the right way. And we became fast friends just in those few days, and it became a habit that at the end of his at the morning news block, I would call him in the office, and we would chat for a little bit and just go over things. And it became very simple that we were almost brothers from another mother, even though we're a few years apart age-wise. But we were fast friends, and we just got along tremendously. And I owe him a heck of a lot because down the road he was the main man responsible for me becoming the play-by-play voice of the Houston Oilers from 1990 to 1993.
What was it like working with him and Bum on the Oilers broadcast, and how did you do that? Because a lot of people don't necessarily think of three-man radio teams doing NFL games.
Well, we were one of the first three-man teams. That's how it all came to pass. The KTRH had been the longtime station for the Oilers up until 1995, and in 1995, KODA got a contract with the Oilers, and the Oilers may have been the first, if not the first, they were one of the first stations to put their games on an FM dial in 1985, and they had a 5-year contract with Coda. And Jerry Trupiano, who was the sports director at KTRH, stayed at KTRH, but was allowed to continue as the Oilers' voice until he eventually moved into a Major League Baseball spot in 1989 with the Montreal Expos. And the final year of that contract at Coda, Steve Fallon, the son of the legendary Frank Fallon, the longtime Baylor announcer, did the games in 1989, and the Oilers came back to KTRH KLOL in 1990, and that was part of the selling packages. You would not only have an FM radio voice, but you would also have the main AM station in the entire Southwest to carry your ball games. So the games were simulcast at that time on both AM and FM on KTRH and KLOL. So they were looking for a new play-by-play voice at that particular time. There was an audition process that was going on. John had succeeded Jerry as the sports director, and management of KTRH KLOL at that particular time really wanted John, as their sports director, to be the voice of the games. But because John and I were longtime friends, John realized he was far more involved in the audition process. I was just a candidate. He was not only a candidate, but he was also one of the ones culling through all the auditions that were going on. John realized that it might be better that if I were to take over the play-by-play, because I was stronger in that area than he was, not that he was incompetent by any stretch of the imagination, but he would be better suited to and here was the big announcement for the games coming back to KTRH KLOL, was bringing Bum into the booth. And as the third person in the booth, not only could John be the analyst, but he could also work with Bum and make Bum more acclimated to working in radio, because Bum had never had any experience of this kind of nature. So I could be the play-by-play guy. The two of them could work on the analysis and would go from there. And because the three of us all had the same mindset, which was to present the best broadcast possible, there was no ego involved with any sense of the imagination. We just went on, and it just was melded together as good as you could possibly ask. It was like a seamless process, like we had done this for a long time. It became three guys who would just sit together and talk about football, talking about the game in our various roles as it was. And as I mentioned, there was no internet back in those days, so the main objective that John and I had when we started doing the broadcast with Bum was we wanted to make sure that at some point Monday, when everybody got back to work and gathered around, we wanted to make sure people were saying, "Did you hear what Bum had to say about?" At some point in the game, we wanted to have something come out somehow, some way. We would get Bum to make one of his only, as Bum could do, statements that people would talk about the next day, because that would drive listeners to the broadcast. And I think it was in that area that John just excelled, because he was the perfect straight man, if you will, for Bum. And to set him up to make him the focal point of the broadcast, and the 2 years that we were the threesome, couldn't have worked out any better.
John had a broadcast life before he came to Houston. He worked for Charlie O'Finley, and he also covered the Miracle on Ice. Can you tell us a story that John told you about being there for that?
It's funny, and I don't know that a whole lot of people know about it, but everybody remembers the Al Michaels statement, "Do you believe in miracles?" Yes, at the end of the ball game, as time expired in the win over the Russians in the semifinal game. And what happened is that John was working on the radio call for ABC at that particular point in time, and the booths were side by side with the TV booth, and they got to a commercial break in the third period after Mike Eruzione had scored the go-ahead goal, and Mike leaned over to Al Michaels, and he had known Al from their dealings on the West Coast, and he looked over at Al and he says, "Do you believe in miracles?" And Al would eventually wound up incorporating that into the finish that everybody knows about, but John may have been the guy behind that.
So John leaned over to him and said that, huh?
Yeah, during a commercial break, leaned from one booth to the next one and said to Al Michaels, after the U.S. had taken the lead in the third period, it's like, "Do you believe in miracles? Could this really happen?" And Al became famous for it.
Maybe it got in Al's head and he forgot about it, because I always hear Al tell this story. The only thing I could think about at the end of the game was miraculous, and that came to my head, and that's why the call happened.
Well, there was something there, but the way John recounted that story, and this was a long time ago. We're talking 30 years ago now. After he first got there to KTRH, this was one of the first stories he told me, was that he said, "Yeah, I leaned over the booth and told Michael that, midway through the third period, after the U.S. took the lead, he said, 'Do you believe in miracles?' And look what he did with it." I can't, I wasn't there, so I don't know which guy is right, but I'll take the word of John O'Reilly on this one, because I've known him for so long and he wouldn't steer me wrong.
Just a fantastic guy, as you said. And thank you so much for reminiscing a little bit about John O'Reilly, and a friend of yours and a mentor, and always great to have you on the show. And we'll talk some harder sports the next time. I promise, a little bit more fun stuff next time we have you on. But it's great to hear the stories about John.
My pleasure, Robert, and call anytime.
You're listening to Houston Sports Talk.
Don't forget to follow Houston Sports Talk on Facebook and Twitter. Subscribe to us on iTunes, Spotify, the Google Podcast app, or the Stitcher app. You can support us by giving us a 5-star review on iTunes, or by telling your friends about us. Spread the word, everybody. Thanks for listening.